Ava Thompson walked into the law firm for her first day, her heart brimming with hope and ambition. The polished marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the tall windows framed a cityscape that whispered promises of success. She was eager to prove herself. After all, she had spent years working her way up, fighting through barriers and earning a degree that no one could dispute. But as she made her way past the sleek glass doors into the heart of the firm, she felt the weight of something that wasn't as visible as the shiny walls around her. A subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of doubt. Her colleagues, most of whom were white, offered her polite smiles as she entered the room. But their eyes lingered just a moment too long, a flicker of uncertainty flashing before they returned to their work. The greeting was courteous, but Ava could feel the tension, the invisible divide that existed between them and her. She didn't belong here, not in the way they did. The firm, a beacon of power and prestige, was an exclusive club where appearances mattered far more than substance. And despite her impeccable qualifications, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that her race was the first thing they saw, not the resume she had worked so hard to build. The unspoken biases that existed here weren't overt. They were more dangerous for their subtlety. It was in the hesitant pauses before her name was said, in the lingering stares that made her question if she was even worthy of being in the same room. "Welcome to the team," one of her colleagues said, a middle-aged woman with a tight smile. "I'm sure you'll do great here." Ava forced a smile back. She had heard the same words before, so many times, but they never felt real. The backhanded nature of their compliments was always there, woven into the fabric of polite conversation. No one said it outright, but she knew. She was different. As the days went on, Ava quickly realized that her race was a constant barrier, even in the most innocuous situations. In meetings, her ideas were often dismissed before they even had a chance to take root. She'd raise her hand, present her arguments, but they'd be glossed over, only to be picked up later by one of her white colleagues. When she questioned the oversight, she was met with the usual excuse, "Oh, I didn't hear you." But Ava knew better. She watched as her colleagues interacted with each other, their camaraderie obvious. They shared inside jokes, exchanged stories from the weekend, and made decisions with ease. Ava wasn't included. She was an outsider in her own workplace, caught in a system that had already decided her worth. Her frustration began to mount. She had worked so hard to get here, to prove that she deserved this position. But no matter how much she achieved, how many hours she put in, how hard she fought, it always felt like there was a glass ceiling above her, something intangible that held her back. Her race had become the first hurdle in everything. Her qualifications didn't matter as much as they should. She realized with quiet agony that no matter what she did, there would always be a question mark next to her name, a lingering doubt she could never escape. The weight of this discrimination had been building for months, and one night, as she walked back to her apartment, the memories of her upbringing flashed before her eyes. She saw her mother, the activist, standing tall in the face of prejudice, speaking out when others stayed silent. Ava had learned from her mother how to challenge injustice head-on, how to demand respect in a world that seemed intent on denying it. Stand tall, even when the world tries to bring you down. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Ava had carried those words with her entire life. She had faced hardships before, fought battles that seemed insurmountable, and had always come out stronger. But here, at this firm, she found herself wondering if those battles were even winnable. David Carter, one of the senior partners, was the embodiment of everything Ava had feared. He was powerful, successful, and deeply entrenched. The old systems of power that upheld racial inequalities. He rarely acknowledged her presence, but when he did, it was with an air of condescension that made her feel small. He was quick to dismiss her ideas and even quicker to offer criticisms. She was nothing more than an obstacle to his comfortable world, and his casual remarks made it clear that he didn't believe someone like her belonged here. "Do you really think this is the kind of case you're ready for?" David had asked her in one meeting, his tone dripping with disdain. We're Talking about a high-profile client, not a charity case. Ava's stomach churned at the implications of his words. He was questioning her ability, her worth, as if she could never measure up to the standard of those who had the privilege of being born into this world. She was being tested, not on her skill, but on her ability to survive in a system that wanted to keep her in her place. Despite David's dismissive attitude, Ava stood firm. She wasn't just here to prove herself to him. She was here to show that she belonged, not only as an attorney, but as a force that could change the landscape of this firm. She was determined to break down the walls that had been built to keep people like her out. And then came the case, the one that could change everything. Ava was handed the responsibility of representing a former employee who had been unfairly dismissed due to racial discrimination. It was a case that could either elevate her career or bury it. The stakes were high, and Ava felt the pressure mount with every passing day. But it was more than just a case. It was a chance for her to prove to everyone, including herself, that she was more than what they saw when they looked at her. David, however, wasn't convinced. From the very beginning, he dismissed her ability to handle such a high-stakes case. He didn't believe she could succeed, not because of her lack of skill, but because of who she was. "Let me handle the big cases," David had said, his voice tinged with arrogance. "This one's probably too much for you, don't you think?" But Ava refused to let him dismiss her. She refused to let anyone dismiss her. She had spent too long fighting to let her worth be defined by the color of her skin. This case, this battle, wasn't just about winning. It was about breaking the chains that had been shackling her all along. As the days leading up to the trial passed, Ava poured everything she had into preparing for the case. She studied every detail, every piece of evidence. She knew the company's policies, its history, and the countless stories of those who had been harmed by its practices. She was ready. She would prove to David, to the firm, and to herself that she was capable, not because she had to be, but because she was more than enough. And this time she would not be ignored. She would rise, not just for her own success, but for every person who had ever been overlooked simply because they were different. Ava sat at her desk, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The case before her could change everything: her career, her place in the firm, and perhaps even her own sense of self. She had worked tirelessly, long nights filled with legal papers and notes, preparing herself for what she knew would be her defining moment. But no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much effort she put into every detail, she still felt like she was invisible. The office was silent except for the tapping of keyboards and the occasional rustle of papers, but Ava's thoughts were far from quiet. She looked across the room at her colleagues, all deep in their own work. None of them paid her any attention, not even when she'd given her best presentation last week. David Carter, the senior partner, had dismissed her. Contributions outright, questioning her readiness for such a high-profile case. "Do you really think this is your area of expertise, Ava?" David had asked, his voice sharp and disinterested. "This isn't some small-time case. It's a corporate battle with serious implications." Ava remembered the sting of his words. It wasn't just his questioning that hurt. It was the way he said it. His tone wasn't about concern or mentorship. It was about belittling her, reminding her of her place in the firm. "I'm more than ready, David," she had responded, her voice steady, but the doubt crept in, gnawing at her confidence. "I've been studying this case for weeks." But his eyes had already moved on, back to the others in the room. "We'll see," he'd muttered under his breath, as if it wasn't even worth his time to fully consider her response. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this way. It wasn't just David. It was the constant, quiet dismissal that came from every direction. She had to prove herself over and over again, not just through her work, but through her very existence. Every idea she brought up was scrutinized more harshly than her colleagues. Every decision she made seemed to be questioned, not because it lacked merit, but because of who she was. Her thoughts were interrupted by a colleague approaching her desk, clipboard in hand. "Ava, can you review these reports for me? It's not a huge task, just a quick check." It was the same every time, always the small tasks. Always the tasks that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. She swallowed her frustration. It was hard to know whether it was because she was a woman, because of her race, or both, but it was exhausting. I'll get to it right after I finish this brief, she replied, her voice laced with a forced calm. It's a bit urgent. The colleague, a man in his mid-30s, didn't even glance at the brief she was working on. Instead, he nodded and walked off, clearly unconcerned with whether her work was truly more pressing. The slight, the dismissal. It always came in different forms, but it always felt the same. Ava leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of isolation sink into her chest. She wondered if anyone saw her for who she really was, the woman who had worked tirelessly to get here, who had fought through the challenges of growing up in a neighborhood where success seemed unreachable. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Stand tall, even when the world tries to bring you down. Ava clung to those words as she pulled up the case files again, but even as she refocused, the question lingered in her mind. Was she truly here because of her skill, or was she just the token diversity hire placed to check a box? She shook the thought away, determined to press on. But as she worked, a wave of doubt began to creep in. She had spent years trying to prove her worth in a world that didn't want to acknowledge people like her. And now, as she prepared for a case that could define her career, she felt like she was being pushed into a corner by the very system she had fought to be a part of. Later that afternoon, as Ava walked out of the office for a quick coffee break, she overheard a conversation between two colleagues. It was almost a whisper, but the words were clear, cutting through her like a knife. Did you see who they hired for that corporate case? Ava Thompson. They say she's the quota hire. Can you believe it? Ava froze in her tracks, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't help but hear the dismissive tone, the judgment that stung more than she expected. Quota hire. Was that all she was to them? Was that how the firm viewed her? She felt the rush of anger, frustration, and embarrassment flutter at once. She turned quickly, trying to hide the hurt on her face, but it was already too late. The damage had been done. That comment would echo in her mind for days. Back at her apartment that night, Ava collapsed onto the couch, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She thought about her mother's legacy, how she had fought against these same injustices, how she had taught Ava to never let the world define her. Her mother had never been afraid to speak up, to challenge the systems that tried to keep her down. Ava felt that fire stir within her again, but it was tempered by the exhaustion of constantly fighting. It was during these quiet moments that Ava realized the true nature of her struggle. The fight wasn't just with David Carter, or even with her colleagues. It was with a system that perpetuated discrimination without ever saying a word. It was systemic, ingrained in every corner of the firm, and no matter how hard she worked, she would always be fighting against it. But she knew she couldn't back down. She had a duty, not just to herself, but to everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. The next day, she dove deeper into the case. As she uncovered more details about the company's discriminatory practices, it became clear that this wasn't just about one person's injustice. It was a reflection of a much larger issue. Ava knew this wasn't just a fight for one client. This was a fight to expose the ugly truths about the corporate world. It was a fight for equality, for fairness, and for the future. As she spent hours preparing, David's words echoed in her mind. This is a man's game. His condescension was a slap in the face, but Ava was no longer afraid of his judgment. She would prove him wrong. She would fight for this case, not just because it was hers to win, but because it was a chance to prove to everyone, especially herself, that she could rise above the prejudice and the limitations placed on her. The more she worked, the more she reclaimed a sense of power she had almost forgotten. The systems that tried to hold her down weren't invincible. With every piece of evidence she uncovered, with every moment of clarity she found, she was dismantling the walls around her. Ava was determined. This fight was hers, and she wasn't going to lose. Ava walked into the courtroom, her heart pounding as she crossed the threshold. The walls, usually cold and impersonal, seemed to close in on her, a reminder of the weight, of what was at stake. This was it, the trial that could make or break her career. The room was filled with the usual faces, white, confident, seasoned professionals, but Ava knew that today it was her moment. The doubts that had haunted her, for so long the whispers in the hallways of the firm, the quiet judgments, they all led to this very moment. She was ready. Ava's steps were steady as she walked to the table, but the tension in the air made it feel like the world was watching her. She could feel the weight of years of hard work, of every dismissal, every unspoken bias. But this wasn't about them. This was her time to prove to herself that she could stand on her own, in this world, in this room. The case wasn't just about legal facts. It was about who she was, and the world's refusal to see her for what she was truly capable of. As she set her papers down, the door opened with a sharp squeak, and in walked David Carter, the senior partner, his presence commanding attention. He strode into the room with a casual arrogance that made Ava's stomach twist. Late as usual, she muttered under her breath, but the words didn't carry far enough to reach anyone but herself. David barely acknowledged her, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom as if this was just another day for him. He walked over to his side of the room and threw his briefcase down on the table with a thud, glancing at Ava with a raised brow. "Well, I hope we're not wasting too much time on this," he said dismissively, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "It's just another frivolous case. We'll have it wrapped up in no time." His words stung, but Ava didn't flinch. She refused to give him the satisfaction. This wasn't about him. "Let's get this started," she said, standing a little straighter as she faced the jury. David leaned back in his chair, arms folded, as though he couldn't be bothered. "Of course, Ava, but remember, we're representing a major client here, no room for mistakes." His tone dripped with patronizing mockery. Ava's mind raced. She had been underestimated from the start, but she had learned to fight through. Didn't mean his arrogance, the privilege in his every word. It only pushed her to work harder. Her focus was sharp now, more than ever. This wasn't just a battle for her client. It was a fight for every single person who had been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced. She wasn't just here for the verdict. She was here to win. With steady hands, Ava stood before the jury, her voice firm and clear as she presented her case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her words filling the room with a quiet strength. "This is not just a case about one person who was wronged by a corporate giant. It is a case about an entire system built to dismiss people, based on race, based on bias, and based on a deep-rooted inequality that we all must confront." Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the jury, her passion spilling into every word. This isn't just about a paycheck. It's about respect. It's about dignity. And it's about the very human right to be treated fairly, in a place that is supposed to uphold the law. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. This corporation doesn't just need to answer for the mistakes made with this individual. They need to answer for the culture of systemic discrimination they've created, and the harm they've caused for far too long. Ava could feel David's eyes burning into her as she spoke, but she kept her composure. She was doing more than just presenting facts. She was showing them who she was, a force not to be dismissed, a woman whose worth could no longer be ignored. David shifted in his chair, his face a mask of barely contained disdain. He cleared his throat and stood up, interrupting her. "You really think you can stand there and make a case out of this?" he sneered, his voice laced with superiority. "This is a corporate giant we're talking about, Ava. People like you don't make waves in this world, and people like them," he gestured dismissively to the client sitting at the table, "are just looking for handouts. They don't deserve a courtroom this much." The room went still. Ava's heart beat louder in her ears. She could feel the weight of his words, but she was no longer the woman who would let them drag her down. His attempt to belittle her, to make her smaller, to remind her of her place, it didn't work anymore, not today. "People like me?" Ava's voice rang out, calm but resolute. She took a step forward, locking eyes with David. I've spent my life fighting for a seat at this table, and I'm here to stay. You want to talk about handouts? Let's talk about the systems that have handed you everything in this world. Your privilege, your power, your position. It's time that the rest of us get the same fair shot. The courtroom was electric, the tension palpable. David's face flushed, his arrogance slipping just enough for everyone to see. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. Ava didn't give him the chance. I'm not here to beg for a place at the table, she continued, her voice ringing with newfound strength. I'm here to show you that I don't need your permission to be here. I have earned this. I have worked for this. And I will not let you diminish my worth simply because you can't see it. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Ava felt a shift, a quiet turning point that would define her. She wasn't just standing for herself now. She was standing for every person who had been overlooked, dismissed or silenced because they didn't fit the mold. David's face reddened, his mouth tightening into a thin line. But Ava pressed on. She turned to the jury once more, her voice steady and sure. This is bigger than one case. This is about breaking down the walls of a system that tells people like me that we don't belong here, that our voices don't matter. But they do, and I will fight for them until the world understands that. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The jury shifted in their seats, their eyes fixed on her. Ava could feel the power of truth resonating with them, the force of her words cutting through the room like a storm. She had spoken for the unheard. She had spoken for the silenced. David tried once more to interrupt, but this time, the room didn't give him the space. He opened his mouth, but no one listened. The jury didn't need to hear him anymore. They had heard her. Minutes later, as the verdict was read aloud, Ava felt a rush of disbelief flood through her. The words felt like a dream, a victory that she had fought so hard for. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Ava barely heard it. She was standing there, not just as a woman who had won a case, but as a symbol of resilience, of defiance, of everything she had fought for. David's smug face had already begun to crumble as the judge turned toward him with a look of quiet reprimand. Ava didn't need to say anything. She had done what she came to do. The power had shifted. As the courtroom settled, she turned to face her client, her heart swelling with pride. She had proven herself, not just to them, but to herself. She had shown the world that no matter how much they tried to push her down, she would rise. This wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for everyone who had been made to feel small, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Ava had changed the narrative, and she wasn't done yet. Walking out of the courtroom, a quiet smile touched her lips. The world had tried to hold her down, but now she had proven that resilience, authenticity, and talent could break through even the most deeply rooted barriers. The future was hers, and it was only just beginning. Ava sat in her office. The walls that once seemed so imposing now felt like a refuge. The adrenaline from the trial had faded, but the impact of her victory was still echoing in her chest. The case had been hers to win, and she had done it against all odds. But as she sat back in her chair, she knew that the victory was not just her own. It was for everyone who had ever been marginalized, every voice that had been silenced simply because of who they were. Her colleagues were congratulating her, offering praise, but it felt distant, as though it was happening to someone else. They were proud of her, sure, but there was something about the way they said it. They were proud of the victory, proud of the spectacle, but Ava could feel the unspoken hesitation, the subtle distance that still remained. David Carter was nowhere to be found. Word had spread quickly about his fall from grace, his arrogant demeanor crumbling in the face of the truth Ava had uncovered. She had exposed not only his biases, but the very system that had allowed him to thrive at the expense of others. It had all come crashing down in that courtroom, and now David was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered reputation. The office buzzed with conversation, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the change she had fought for, was it real? The subtle resistance that lingered behind every compliment, every smile, was still there, and she could feel it. like a weight in the air. She had won the case, but had she really won their respect? Was it possible to dismantle a system of prejudice? With just one trial, one victory? Great job, Ava, Tom Rivera said as he approached her desk. His voice was different now, softer, almost apologetic. Tom had been a quiet observer for far too long, never speaking out, always watching from the sidelines. Ava had noticed the way he had ignored the subtle injustices, never standing up against the culture of silence that permeated the firm. But today, something was different in his eyes. "Thank you, Tom," Ava replied, her voice steady but cautious. She knew what was coming. He had seen her fight, seen her triumph, and now he was ready to admit something. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low. Ava raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I've been a part of this place for too long, watching it all happen, turning a blind eye. I should have spoken up, should have said something when I saw the way they treated you." Ava sat back in her chair, her gaze softening as she listened. She had always known there was more to Tom, more than the quiet man who never seemed to make waves. And now, in the wake of her victory, he was finally finding his voice. "It's not too late," she said quietly. "You can still make a difference. You've got to stand up for what's right. No one can do it alone." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and resolve. "I know," he said. "And I will. I'll start by changing the way I speak. The way I act around here. I've seen the way people look at you, dismiss you like you don't belong. I won't stand for it anymore." Ava nodded, grateful for the small but meaningful shift. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start. And that was enough. The firm, she knew, would change slowly. But it would change. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Her boss. She picked it up quickly, holding the phone to her ear as her mind raced. "Ava," her boss began, his voice tight with what Ava immediately recognized as an attempt to mask his discomfort. "We've had some talks about what happened in the trial, about your performance. You should know the partners are impressed. They've seen what you can do, and they want to move you forward in the firm." Ava's breath caught in her chest. This was it. This was what she had been working for. But she didn't feel the rush of triumph she thought she would. Instead, she felt a quiet wariness, an awareness that even now she was being tested. "That's good to hear," she said, her voice steady. "But I hope it's more than just a recognition of the case. I hope it's a recognition of what needs to change here. What needs to change in all of us." There was a pause on the other end. Ava knew the conversation could go in 100 different directions, but she was no longer afraid of the outcome. She had already won, and she had already made her point. "We'll keep that in mind," her boss said, his voice uncertain. "We're going to need time, but we'll keep you in the loop." Ava knew that change wasn't going to come easily. The firm had been built on old systems, systems that allowed people like David to thrive while others were pushed aside. But it was changing. It had to. And Ava was going to make sure of it. As the days passed, Ava felt the subtle shift in the office. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't grand, but the small moments were there. More voices were being heard. More colleagues were coming to her for advice, for guidance. They saw her not just as a successful lawyer, but as a role model. Ava was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the future. She found herself in more meetings, not as a token or an afterthought, but as a leader. She guided her colleagues with quiet strength, showing them that standing up to prejudice wasn't just about the big moments. It was about the everyday decisions, the small but powerful choices we make every day. When she returned home after another long day, her heart felt heavy with the weight of what she had achieved. She had succeeded, yes, but the road ahead was still long. She thought about her mother's words, words that had shaped her, words that had always felt like a light guiding her through the darkness. "You rise, not for you, but for everyone who comes after." Ava closed her eyes, her mother's voice ringing in her ears. This victory wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had been pushed aside, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. And she would continue to rise, for them, for herself, and for the generations that would follow. She knew the journey wasn't over. The fight continued. But for the first time in a long time, Ava felt hopeful. She had started something. She had sparked a change. And no matter what came next, she was ready for it. The world may have tried to hold her back, but Ava knew deep down that she would rise above.